Okay, so I think we'll get started now. So thank you very much, everyone, for showing up. If you haven't had a chance yet, please take a look at the leaflets on your chairs and scan the QR code. That will take you to the agenda. I didn't really think it was relevant to print it out when it was perfectly accessible online. But that will give you a breakdown of the speakers, breakdown of the topic areas, what we'll be discussing today, and hopefully that should kind of guide the conversation moving forward. A slight change to the agenda where Ian Stevens is concerned. I will be taking over his role in presenting that slot. Other than that, we've got some speakers from the EIC who will be speaking very shortly, as well as some pre-recordings from the Saudi-British Joint Business Council and the British-Portuguese Chambers of Commerce. I will be recording this and I will be making this accessible in due course, so everyone will get access to a digital version. It just needs to be edited a bit, make sure it's a bit more internet friendly, I think. But without further ado, I would like to introduce Neil Golding, who will be speaking from the EIC.
Thank you so much, Sam. And we are in the morning, still good morning, everyone. I've presented in many places around the world, Kuala Lumpur, Dubai, Abu Dhabi, Houston, never a racecourse. So it's an absolute pleasure to be here today. And I'm used to Cheltenham Racecourse, that's fair to say, that's where I'm originally from, but this is rather beautiful as well. So thank you ever so much, Sam, for the introduction. As Sam mentioned there, I'm Neil Golding, Director of Market Intelligence at the Energy Industries Council. And next slide. Sorry. And who are the Energy Industries Council? Well, we're a not-for-profit trade association. We were established back in 1943, so we're over 78 years old. And basically, our remit has always been to help support companies on their export journey and helping companies identify where there are global business opportunities. And we do that now in a variety of different ways. Obviously, we didn't have computers in 1943, but we now have a suite of products that allow members at the fingertips to gain market intelligence of what is happening currently in the energy market. So our first product is EIC DataStream. That's our CapEx project tracking database. And globally, we're tracking, it's just shy of 11,000 projects globally across all of the energy sectors. We have the EIC Asset Map, which is looking at the operational assets across all energy sectors, globally as well, although we still to complete Asia Pacific and North America in that particular product. And then EIC Supply Map. We've undertaken an exercise to map the entire UK supply chain capabilities across all of the energy sectors, whether that be onshore wind, whether that be solar, whether that be carbon capture or hydrogen. And these are just some of the topics that I'm going to talk about a little bit later on today. We also are UK's largest energy-related trade association. We have 750 members, most of whom are located here in the UK, but also we have overseas members. And it's with those overseas members that UK companies can look to tie up with and establish good working relationships. We run pavilions as well on behalf of the Department for International Trade when it comes to clean energy. Of course, they're not able to support anymore on the oil and gas side of things. And in fact, just next week, Andy, my colleague Andrew Scudder, who's also here, will be attending ADIPEC, the large oil and gas show in Abu Dhabi. We do run our own events that in this current world are predominantly online and free for any company to be able to attend as things stand currently. It says 130 there. We've in fact done over 200 webinars this year, and that's from all of our offices globally. So that's an aspect I forgot to mention there. We are global in terms of our remit. We have offices, HQ here in London, but we have offices supporting our activities in Kuala Lumpur, in Dubai, Houston and Rio, so all of the major energy hubs. And we also provide a number of market insights reports as well that go into a little bit more detail about some of the new sectors. Next slide, please. So it's enough about the EIC. If you want to find out anything else about us, Andy is here, and Andy will be able to support you. In terms of what I'm going to talk about today, I'm going to give you a bit of a snapshot of what we've seen in 2021. Before I go into a little bit more detail around each of the clean tech sectors specifically. So this very first slide is taking a look at the total number of new developments that have been made during 2021 and the sectors in which those new announcements have been made. Renewables is this large blue chunk here, and it makes up, if you include offshore wind, 58% of all of the new announcements that have been made so far in 2021. But we've also seen a number of new announcements made in what we call the energy transition sectors. So for the purpose of this presentation, that's inclusive of energy storage, hydrogen, carbon capture, and also floating offshore wind. But although you can't see very clearly here, what this is also showing are the oil and gas sectors. And we've seen a steady decline this year and last year as well, impacts of COVID and demand requirements, seeing that there are fewer numbers of new oil and gas projects being announced. And this graph over here on your right-hand side is just showing that very thing. 58% in clean tech, 21% in the other of new projects announced in the energy transition sectors, and just 21% in those mature hydrocarbons, and also the conventional power markets as well. Next slide, please. If we take then a deeper dive into the renewable sector, this is why we're here today. What you can see is that the growth in renewables is largely driven by the commoditized sectors. By commoditized, we're really looking at solar photovoltaic, and also onshore wind. Costs have continued to come down, and many more countries now are expanding their developments in those areas. We're also beginning to see bigger growth right now in offshore wind at the moment. Energy from waste and biomass, not so much, but there's still a reasonable number of projects moving forward. Our energy transition, on the other hand, driven by energy storage, and I'll go into a little bit more detail around the main drivers behind the number of new announcements this year. We're also seeing hydrogen growth. You can't pick up a newspaper at the moment without another mention of hydrogen, whether that be production or whether that be utilising it for transportation. Carbon capture. Is everyone familiar with what carbon capture is? Yep, good stuff, excellent. And then finally, floating offshore wind. Next slide, please. So this is now going to be a slightly deeper dive, and what we've done here is taken a look back at the number of new projects that have been announced for each of the sectors, and I'll then take a look forward into where the investments might well be in these particular sectors. What you can see is that from 2017 onwards, and this graph here is showing solar, is a huge growth in the amount of PV solar projects that are being announced globally. And what we're tracking here are 50 megawatt plus in the main in terms of capacity. We're not looking at those domestic rooftop scale developments. This number here is 2021. That's obviously going to continue to grow, and our expectation is that 2022 will continue to see this drive and yet further announcements being made for new solar projects. That has been aided as well by the reintroduction, certainly here in the UK, of some of the CFDs as well, the contracts for difference for both of these sectors. In terms of onshore wind, not quite the trajectory that we've seen in solar, but once again, we are still expecting numbers to reach similar levels to 2020, if not surpass 2020 in terms of the number of new developments announced. Next slide, please. And here, what I'm showing is the projection forward, and although you can't see it here, some of those major markets for solar as well. So this graph here is just showing the estimated capital expenditure on a year-by-year basis on projects that are due to come on stream or come online. And again, the orange bar here is the solar PV side of things. The blue bit is the solar concentrated solar power. What you'll see is that actually we know that there'll be more capex in 24 and 25, but the reality, this is based on projects that have been announced to date. There is a short time frame in terms of the announcement and then the solar projects being constructed, typically around 24 to 36 months. Hence why we see this peak in 22 and 23 in terms of the investment levels. When we then begin to look at the major markets, they've already got established solar PV. They've already got an established supply chain. So many of these are going to be quite difficult in terms of new entry, especially when we're looking at the conventional fixed solar projects. You have India, US, and Australia here leading the way. What we're also now seeing, and I'll come into this in a bit more detail, is these solar projects being aligned with energy storage and also green hydrogen projects going forward as well. There are, though, new markets emerging, and the Middle East is quite a substantial market, an area of growth that we're expecting to see in solar, and we continue to see prices drive down. There are new technologies around solar. It's becoming more efficient, of course. But it's not just about those solar projects onshore. We're now talking about floating solar projects, and there's a large 1 gigawatt project called Batam in Indonesia that's recently been announced and is receiving some very significant financial support from some Japanese players as well. So the floating side of things, perhaps as well, different technologies, and maybe not an established supply chain in allowing for those solar panels to then be floated. Next slide, please. We're going to move on to onshore wind next. Again, it's a commoditized renewable. And again, we are expecting these numbers to go up the further on down the decade that we go. What we're seeing here is huge growth, especially in the US. And I think recently Texas alone has got over 100 gigawatts of capacity in planning. That's a not insignificant amount. Again, we're going to see yet larger turbines as well introduced. We're going to see repowering opportunities. So it's not just around the new build side of things, but in the established markets here in Europe in particular, many of the turbines are coming to end of life. So there's going to be the opportunity to not just decommission those, but also introduce new, larger projects. Again, limited opportunities, especially for the onshore piece, because quite often in terms of balance of plant, in particular, domestic supply chain is in place, but you have the opportunities in control and instrumentation and electrical works as well. On top of the O&M side of things as well, whereby here in the UK we've got some core capabilities. Again, a lot of the developments that are being announced right now are also aligned with hydrogen and energy storage projects. Next slide, please. And, sorry, yeah, energy storage, right, energy storage. Okay, so what we have here, and this is one of our energy transition sectors that certainly a sector that we consider as being critical as part of the energy transition, is the energy storage. This blue segment here is linked to battery technology. We have seen huge growth this year in a number of new announcements that are being made around batteries, typically lithium-ion as well, in terms of the technology being used. However, there are new technologies that are coming through at the moment, and that they would be inclusive of the compressed air energy storage and liquid air energy storage side of things. In terms of the capital expenditure, we still see hydro, pumped hydro storage as a critical role, or it has a critical role to play. But of course, the investment in batteries is also going to be very significant as well. Next slide, please. And this is these are the markets. Again, if you may recall from the previous two slides, Australia and the US featured very heavily in those in terms of the new capacities being added for onshore wind and solar. Well, aligned to that is the number of new announcements that are being made when it comes to the battery storage, but also pumped hydro as well. The new opportunities that I certainly see, though, there's great opportunities that are in those compressed air and liquid air energy storage facilities. And we see in Spain, for example, Highview Power have announced upwards of potentially $1 billion worth of investment in the compressed air energy storage arena. So that's Highview, why have I mentioned that? Well, they're a UK-based company, so certainly worth engaging with as well from an export perspective. Next slide, please. Now we'll look at energy from waste and biomass, and somewhat, well, these technologies, are they green? Are they purely renewable? Question marks. I personally don't think that they are, because you're having to grow trees continuously. They are potentially sustainable, and energy from waste, you're taking waste and burning it. But still, under the government's plans, they are in scope, as it were. But what we've seen certainly is not the take-up globally of energy from waste projects in terms of the number of new announcements. However, with biomass, we are beginning to see new announcements made globally. And I would expect that to continue as we look at the carbon capture off the back of some of these biomass energy projects going forward, so better known as BECCS plants. Next slide, please. Again, here we are looking at, first off, this is for both energy from waste and biomass, the capex. We are expecting to see a peak at the moment in 2023 in terms of investment in the biomass projects. And it is the UK that is largely driving these projects as well. And that's in terms of, well, that's for the energy from waste, sorry. Investment in biomass is relatively small. Although there are new biomass projects being announced, and one such significant project is happening right now in Japan. Mugati biomass plant has just received $252 million worth of finance from a number of Japanese players. But this market is largely dominated right now by some of the large Danish EPC contractors, so B&W, Berminster and Wine, Berminster, B&W, there we go, B&W Volland, but also many of the Japanese players are now beginning to look at this particular market as well. So it's got a way to go to catch up. Will it be taken up rapidly? It remains unclear at the moment, but I think, again, be mindful that these are very much for the larger scale projects. We're not talking around the 1 megawatt size projects that we perhaps could see in place in sub-Saharan Africa. Next slide, please. Okay, offshore wind. Everyone, seemingly, certainly those that have had previous experience of working in the upstream oil and gas industry, are getting extremely excited around offshore wind. And we have seen, as costs have continued to drop, turbines are becoming larger, we've seen a rapid increase in the number of new projects being announced globally and new markets making these announcements. That's the blue, so that's your fixed bottom. Your orange here is your floating offshore wind, newer technology that is now coming to the market and where we're expecting to see some significant areas of growth. These announcements here, the 2017, 2018, the numbers were typically low prior to that. And as a consequence, investment over the next 4 years in terms of the projects and the capacity, coming online, it's going to be relatively low. However, what you can see, there's going to be a peak in 2025, and then actually after that, some significant capacity being added globally. And actually, I would imagine these numbers, as more projects get signed off, will also increase in terms of capacity. Huge targets are being announced as well by many governments in here in the UK, currently 10 gigawatts. And we have targets of adding another 30 gigawatts by 2030. It's going to be a challenge to hit that, I think it's fair to say. Next slide, please. And when we begin to look at the markets, this is the UK. We are number 3 in terms of the number or the amount of capacity that we're going to add by 2030. China leads the way. China's, of course, not without its challenges. And in fact, having spoken to a company who shall remain nameless, there are already wind farms and turbines installed which are not on any navigational maps, so that capacity could be far higher in China. Brazil, frontier market, very interesting, has huge potential. The US has huge potential as well. You've got South Korea in here, Japan, Poland, their government has just announced huge support for offshore wind as well. So all markets of interest. One thing to be very mindful of is local content, though, and establishing a presence in many of these markets. Most of these countries are now looking for companies to embed themselves and be part of the local supply chain. So that's just something to be, like I say, be mindful of when looking at some of these opportunities in offshore wind. And on to the final slides, I think, and they are linked to hydrogen and carbon capture. 2 reasons why we're seeing, and why we have seen, huge growth. I think everyone during COVID, and certainly the oil and gas industry, was beginning to wonder, well, okay, this industry is not going to be around forever. What can we do? We need to start investing in hydrogen. But also, the dual pillar, we've got a climate emergency right now. We need cleaner fuels. And hence why we're seeing a huge amount of growth right now in the pure renewable, in the pure clean hydrogen, so the green hydrogen element. There are also right now an increase in the number of announcements that have been made for blue hydrogen, so utilising gas, hydrogen produced off the back of gas, but with carbon capture associated with it. And that number there, the increase here in the number of blue hydrogen projects, I guess is reflected here when you look at the increase in the number of carbon capture and utilisation and storage projects that have been announced. And it's recognised that industry can't decarbonise without carbon capture. And again, we are beginning to see the number of new announcements being made around the globe in carbon capture currently. Next slide, please. And so where are those markets for hydrogen, first off? Firstly, let's look at the CapEx. We're moving from demo scale to commercial scale, mid-decade. And hence why the numbers at the moment look relatively low in terms of capital expenditure globally across green and blue. That will peak in the next 5 years in 2025 and onwards. We're going to see huge investments made and Australia leads the way here. Huge investments being made, all linked to the commoditized renewables, solar and onshore wind as well. We're also seeing here Mauritania as a market, sub-Saharan Africa, close to Europe market. They have that hydrogen market on their doorstep. Again, green hydrogen. And the company called CWP is certainly driving forward with many of the projects, or with the one big project in that particular region. What you also find is there are more blue hydrogen projects being announced as well, and certainly in those industrialized countries. So Canada, they're announcing carbon capture projects, blue hydrogen on the back of it. Same with the US, and certainly here in the UK, where just last week, I think it was, the announcement was made by the UK government to support the carbon capture projects, the first two large cluster projects. So you've got your Teesside, or East Coast Cluster as it's known now, and HyNet that are going to be supported. We have the opportunity here in the UK to build a supply chain. There isn't at the moment an existing supply chain to deliver all of these projects. And so we need to build electrolyser capacity in particular. Next slide, please. And this is the final slide in terms of a look forward before the summary. Carbon capture has a checkered history. It's reliant upon government support. Certainly here in the UK, in the last decade, the rug was pulled from under the industry. However, now, as I mentioned previously, the government has come out with support for these new cluster developments, and it's not new technology. It's already being used, although not widely. There's not that many existing projects currently. What we are expecting is that this number, which is 2026, I think, for this particular graph, that number will continue to ramp up and increase. We're going to see carbon capture adopted more widely, and we're beginning to see announcements made in the likes of Indonesia and Malaysia as well, as they look to decarbonise their upstream industry in particular, but also utilising the capture for enhanced oil recovery as well. The UK is, at the moment, in terms of near term anyway, leading in terms of investment, but there's projects are already underway. Netherlands and Norway in particular already some significant projects. And the US, ExxonMobil have announced that they're going to spend 100 billion on carbon capture. So this is going to be a significant industry going forward, and one in which any company that's worked in the processing sector, whether that be refining petrochemicals, in the midstream sector, whether that be pipelines or liquefaction or regasification, or the upstream sector, whether that be in the reservoir side of things or the drilling side of things, the carbon capture industry will represent opportunities for that entire supply chain. And final slide, please. This, again, is not dissimilar to the very first graph I showed you, which looks at the number of new announcements made. But what I'm looking at here is the amount of money that's going to be spent on each sector in the near term. And what you'll find is that renewables will form a large chunk of that expenditure globally. But if I go over here, when you look at the mature renewables and clean tech sector, it makes up, I think that's 33% in total of global investments between now and 2026. The mature hydrocarbons and power sectors are here certainly in the near term, and there will be continued investment. So it's just one thing to be mindful of. is that those oil and gas opportunities haven't gone away, but we will continue to see growth in mature renewables. And whilst energy transition only makes 4% of CapEx globally, in one of those projects that we're tracking in our databases, that number as well will increase as new announcements are made, and it'll be interesting to see what the fallout is of COP26 once the governments have all agreed on the targets. So that is it from myself. Thank you very much for your time. Really do appreciate it. And Sam, I guess I'm handing back to you.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Neil. It was certainly interesting to have a look at the capital expenditures on all the different kinds of renewable energy projects that are going on globally. And I think that's an important thing to realise, that it's the CapEx that guides and influences the demand almost, the operational spending, and ultimately the supply chain purchases that occur, which I think, looking at a number of companies here, that's going to be the opportunities they're interested in. You're not necessarily too fussed about operations or kind of EPC and design, but ultimately the specific components of those projects. So moving more specifically now, we've got a good global idea of projects provided by the EIC. We're going to move more specifically to the Saudi market, and Chris Enos Hopkins from the Saudi British Joint Business Council has very kindly put together a pre-recording on the opportunities in that marketplace. So I will now play that pre-recording and we'll take it from there.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Chris Innes Hopkins. I'm the UK Executive Director of the Saudi British Joint Business Council, based in London. So very happy to be joining you today, at least virtually, and thank you to Sam Beard for the kind invitation. I'd like to talk to you today about the Saudi renewable energy market, but before doing so, let me just set the scene with a bit of background on SBJBC, what we do, how we can help, and also to talk about the Saudi market in general before getting into specific opportunities. So SBJBC, we are a not-for-profit, private sector-led membership organisation, very lightly resourced, but we do have some great members on both sides. And we organise regular sector-based events in both countries. We can provide introductions to potential partners as well as trusted service providers, and we can communicate business concerns to both countries, an example being our regular dialogue with the Saudi Ministry of Investment on some of the trade and investment barriers faced by our members. And lastly, just to note, we are part of the British Chambers of Commerce Global Business Network. Saudi Vision 2030, I'm sure many of you have heard about this ambitious plan that was launched about 5 years ago by the Saudi Crown Prince, Prince Mohammed bin Salman, to increase the role of the private sector in the economy and, importantly, to diversify it away from oil. So some very ambitious targets, and on the whole, good progress is being made, but challenges do remain. On the renewable energy front, there is an objective to generate 50% of Saudi electricity needs from renewable sources by 2030. And to do that, they are going to have to attract more private sector investment, I think, into projects, and I'll talk about that a bit in a minute. Saudi Vision 2030 does offer amazing business opportunities for UK companies, and you will see, if you visit Saudi, a number of our members present on the ground in different sectors, whether it's professional services, training, engineering, project management, or even privatization. So the door is wide open, and we would encourage people to take advantage of the close relationship between both countries and the sort of assistance that we can offer through our networks in both countries. So talking about the giga projects, I think some of you will have heard about NEOM, a very ambitious smart city project about the size of Belgium, so actually more than just a city. And it is what they like to describe a living laboratory where they will be testing out new digital technologies, robotics, and will be dependent very much on renewable energy to power this development, as will the Red Sea Development Project, which is a very ambitious tourism, high-end tourism project along the Red Sea below NEOM. Nearer to Riyadh, we have the Qiddiya Entertainment City, and also there's the Diriyah Gate Authority. Many of these offer a range of sports and tourism development opportunities closer to Riyadh. What we can benefit from is the closeness of the UK-Saudi strategic partnership. And this followed the Crown Prince's visit here in 2018, when Saudi made clear they're looking very much to the UK for expertise to help with the economic and some of the social reforms planned. So we do have examples now of much greater UK participation in some of the giga projects, as I've mentioned, but also there is evidence of more Saudi investment in the UK, not just in Newcastle, as you may have heard, but for example, in technology companies such as Babylon Health and Revolut, the fintech company. So there's clearly potential to do a lot more, and that includes the clean energy and the clean tech space. And our ambition as an organisation is to leverage much more private sector engagement into these government-to-government agreements. The Saudi Green Initiative was launched just before COP26, and for the first time, the Crown Prince announced an intention for Saudi Arabia to reach net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2060. Hopefully that can be improved on, but I think it is a very clear evidence of ambition. And they are looking to the role of clean energy to help with that, as well as what they call the carbon circular economy and carbon capture, where they do have some advanced technologies already, and a very ambitious tree planting program, literally millions or billions of trees over the next few years. On the renewable energy front, Saudi does intend to become a major player both in solar and wind power. And there have already been a significant number of projects tendered. And I think, as you've seen, the cost of renewable energy has come down as subsidies on diesel, petrol and electricity prices have gradually been removed. So that has improved the market for renewable energy projects. Just an example of some of the current projects. As I've said, there's 20 gigawatts of solar and about 7 gigawatts of wind planned by 2024. And this represents an $18 billion project pipeline, 13 billion of which is already being tendered or in the course of being tendered. One of the big solar projects is in Sakarya, and that's well underway. And there's a wind farm in Dumat Al Jandal, as well as another one planned in Jubail. So pretty good progress. Rounds 1, 2 and 3, and rounds 4 and 5 are now planned. And then you have got plans for ambitious green hydrogen production, apparently up to $300 billion. Seems an amazing figure, but this will include a very big plant at the NEOM facility, and planning for that is actively underway at the moment. Just to note, clearly there's a lot of detail here, and there is a handout that I can make available on some of these projects if you kindly ask Sam, and I'll ensure it is sent to those companies interested. Moving on to the procurement process, it is important to understand how important local content is in getting on the tender lists. Aqua Power, I'll come on to in a moment, and Aramco and SABIC both have very big supply chains, and pre-qualification is necessary. And to do that, suppliers do need to demonstrate a minimum percentage of local content in order to get on some of the bidding lists. And this will vary between projects, but it is a relevant factor in adjudicating bids. Support is available to help companies increase on local content, and the Ministry of Investment Industrial Clusters Programme, as well as the companies above, can help in this. Aqua Power, if you're talking about renewables, Aqua Power is synonymous. It's a majority public investment fund company which has now been floated on the Saudi Stock Exchange, and they've won significant part of the big tenders already placed on the renewables front. Their ambition is to develop about $30 billion worth of projects by 2030. Certainly well worth having a look at their website and the possibility of getting involved in some of their supply chains. Example of the sort of activity that SPJBC can do, we did take the first UK renewable energy mission to Saudi back in 2019 in close coordination with the DIT team in Saudi. We had a delegation of about 20 companies and some really great visits and a high-level workshop on regulatory issues, which was hosted by our Saudi partners at the Federation of Saudi Chambers. Great feedback, and we do hope to repeat that very soon. I'll come on to one of the companies that has used the mission to get a significant contract, which is Solar Water PLC. And Solar Water, as I've mentioned, produces desalinated water through solar-powered desalination plants, and these have now been chosen by NEOM in a pilot phase, and this is well underway now. And the company, as I say, made its first contacts with NEOM, and others on our mission, I think, returned to the market 6 or 7 times to get this very significant project underway. Now, just a few business tips about the market. I mean, it is important to realize the culture, the business practices, although English is widely spoken, the processes are different, and you can find yourself going in a circular way rather than a straight A to B way. You need to take your time, invest in the relationship building, and note, not just jump straight into business. You do need to get to know your Saudi partners. Clearly that has been a challenge during the recent pandemic, although like everyone else, the Saudis have adapted well to online working and Zoom. They're not great at reading particularly long emails. Once you get to know people, you'll find WhatsApp, text message is much more effective. And then a phone call to them once you arrive to confirm an appointment. It can be a little bit intimidating and what we call lastminute.com, but usually things do come together. And I would advise, not to sort of plan weeks ahead, to be clear on your objectives, but it will take time to pin down your meetings. Usually you'll end up with a much busier program than you first thought, but you do need to leave room for maneuver. Like everywhere else, you do need to evaluate your business partner, not jump straight into an exclusive relationship. And do bear in mind the size of the Saudi market, where you will need representation, not just in Riyadh, but you have to think about Jeddah on the Red Sea coast, and then of course the big industrial energy complex in Eastern Province, where Aramco is based. And sometimes you will need different representatives in each of those markets. You do need to take local legal advice, and of course the local legislation is Sharia compliant. We have plenty of legal members, certainly can recommend some of those, but you'll also find information through some of the service providers that we use, who can brief you on some of the do's and don'ts, and can help you with everything from a visa to renting transport when you're there. Do try and visit as often as you can. As I've said, contracts do require, patient relationship building and regular visits, and don't expect to jump, straight into the market. It can take, 1 or even 2 years to get that first contract. But provided you commit to a long-term presence and transfer of skills and local content in the market, normally the rewards are well worth the effort. So we say, I like to talk about the 3 Ps, presence, persistence, and patient relationship building. Support on the ground, there's a lot of options here, and we do work closely with the Department for International Trade teams. The lead energy sector advisor in Saudi is Khalid Darazi. He's based in Eastern Province, and certainly well worth getting in contact with him if you visit. The SPJBC contact is the Federation of Saudi Chambers, and I do have a Saudi counterpart, Nada Al-Shanafi, who can help particularly with member inquiries. And then, of course, the Ministry of Investment, who do have a office in the UK, Abdulaziz Al-Kafali, can also introduce you to some of his sector-based team in Saudi, who can give you a lot of important information. There's Arabian Enterprise Incubators. AEI Saudi is one of the service providers we have a relationship with, and they are also part of the Overseas Business Network initiative, work closely with the British Embassy. Yazan Shukair is a good point of contact there. And last but not least, the Energy Industries Council, Ryan McPherson, who's based in Dubai and heads the Middle East office. And we work closely with Ryan, particularly on a Saudi Arabia Connect event, which took place, I think, last November, which was a great introduction to the market, and series of webinars. And I think probably a recording of that is still available. Just focusing in on upcoming SPJBC events, during the recent Future Investment Initiative in Riyadh, we launched and had the first agreement with an anchor partner for the Saudi UK Tech Hub. And we do expect the Saudi Ministry of Communications and the UK Science and Innovation Network to come on board with this soon. The hub will launch a series of activities in early 2022, including fintech, clean tech and health tech. And this will be an important platform for joint activity and amplifying existing initiatives in the tech sector. We're also planning a renewable energy forum, probably in March 2022. This will focus in on clean energy and tech sector opportunities, including hydrogen, as well as the finance available for projects. And we'll be cooperating with a number of other partners on this, and further information will be available early in the new year. So do have a look also on our website, www.sbjbc.org. Lots of information there on previous and planned events. If you're in London, very happy to see you. We have a small office in Mayfair. Please do get in touch. My email is director@sbjbc.org. And I do wish you a very successful day. Please do contact either myself or Sam if you need further information. Thank you very much, and look forward to catching up with you soon.
So thank you very much, Chris. Just out of interest, if anyone does want to get in touch with Chris or any of the contacts that he mentioned in the presentation, just get in touch with me. I'll forward you that list. And like I said, once I've edited the recording for this presentation, I'll distribute that amongst all of you. To move a bit further west now and north, we're going to focus a bit more on the Portuguese market, and the British Portuguese Chambers of Commerce, with one of their members, Solar Balance, has very kindly put together a bit of an overview on this market segment. So I'm going to now play the pre-recording from Colin Reid at Solar Balance, and he'll go through that with you.
Good day to everybody. Thank you very much for inviting me to speak on behalf of the British Portuguese Chamber of Commerce and on behalf of Solar Balance here in Portugal. My name is Colin Reid. I'm the General Manager of Solar Balance here in Portugal. I'm a UK and European chartered engineer with 30 years experience in the energy industry. I spent the past 15 years working in Portugal on a number of successfully delivered solar projects, and also I have been involved in the past on other renewable energy schemes such as heat pumps and thermal solar, which I'll touch on later on. Obviously, with my experience and qualifications, I have an in-depth knowledge of the Portuguese market. I've worked here obviously for 15 years. I've worked in various industries and on various schemes, from small-scale residential projects up to very large-scale projects, which will come on later in the presentation. So the company I work for is Solar Balance. We're based in Quinta do Lago, which is about 15 minutes drive from Faro, here in southern Portugal. The company was established in 2011, so we're almost exactly 10 years old now. During the course of since the company was established, we purchased some licenses from the government in Portugal as part of a government tender for solar power. And with those projects, with those licenses, we then built and operate utility scale solar parks. The current portfolio is 9 megawatts. We have 2 solar parks, which I'll come on to show you shortly. And we're always looking for new opportunities, but particularly now we're looking at developing solar projects with green hydrogen, as I mentioned before, which is a very important part of Portugal's strategy for renewable energy. One of the plants that Solar Balance built in 2014 was this one in Cascais, which is northwest of Lisbon. And you can see in the background there the Castle of Sintra. This plant is 4.5 megawatts peak capacity and was connected to the grid in 2014. And since then, for the past 7 years, has been successfully selling electricity directly into the national grid. The other solar park that we built is near Palmela, which is south of Portugal, south of Lisbon, sorry, south of the river. And once again is 4.5 megawatts peak capacity. This park we're actually looking to expand very shortly. We've been given permission by the government to add a small expansion part to this solar plant to increase the output. But again, this was connected to the grid at the same time as the one in Cascais, and has been delivering and selling energy into the grid, national grid, very successfully for the past 7 years. The company that built our solar parks and also maintains our solar parks is a company called Efosec, which may be of interest to you there today in Staffordshire. Efosec is a Portuguese company, a very large multinational global Portuguese business, but based in Porto, near Porto in Portugal. They're a company that not only executes EPC contracts and carries out O&M contracts as they do for us, but they also build their own switchgear. They're involved in all sorts of energy systems. So they manufacture transformers, inverters, and so on. They're also involved in electricity for transport. They make charging stations for electric vehicles. So a very, very influential company in Portugal. And they did an excellent job building our solar parks, and they're doing an excellent job maintaining them as well. So we have a very good relationship with Efosec. And in fact, we're looking to expand our business into green hydrogen using Efosec as one of our partners. So it'd be well worth making contact with them in terms of supply chain for the projects that we're doing. Moving on now to renewables in Portugal. When we first got involved, the policy at that time was to buy licenses at a high price. And these licenses came with feed-in tariffs, which was very generous rates for selling electricity to the grid. That was 10 years ago. They obviously don't exist anymore. Feed-in tariffs have been phased out, obviously because they're not sustainable. And also because the cost of the equipment, the plant, has reduced significantly. So the capital cost of equipment, solar panels, switchgear and so on has reduced considerably. And it's probably in the region of about 50% cost of what it was when we built our solar parks. So for that reason, there's no incentive anymore to support or provide grants for building solar parks. So the move now has been for developers in Portugal and beyond to build large-scale grid-connected solar plants of 100 megawatts, 200 megawatts, and so on. So extremely large solar parks. And they have been built and are being built as we speak in Portugal. There are many down here in the south and others south of Lisbon, north of here, that are being built and have been built. And these now, instead of selling with a feed-in tariff, what companies are doing now is to either sell into the free market in Spain and Portugal, the Iberian free electricity market, or they sign PPAs, power purchase agreements, with utility companies such as GAL, BDP, and so on. So those are the two methods, if you like, for developers to sell their electricity into the grid. So that's very much the way things are done nowadays. And that proves to be very viable, particularly here in Portugal, where you get so much sunshine. It makes so much sense to build these parks without feed-in tariffs. And it works. You do get a reasonable return. And many utility companies are doing this now. The other move as well, which is important to note, is what they call auto-consumption here. So this is more localized solar facilities. So what's happening is, both at the residential level and industrial and commercial level, is that companies are actually building solar parks to power their own premises, because there's no feed-in tariffs. It doesn't make sense to sell the electricity back to the national grid. It makes more sense to use the power for yourself, your own consumption. And this works well now on houses and on businesses and on industries where they have big roofs. They install these systems and they actually use the solar power themselves. And as I say, it's very, very viable here in Portugal because of the amount of sunshine we get, and the returns are excellent. In 5 years or so is a typical rate of return or time of return at the moment for those sort of systems, or can be up to 5 years, the return on investment. So it is very viable to do that. Many companies and even residential owners are doing that now. There's also other activities and other ways that the Portuguese government is trying to convert fossil fuel power stations to renewables. We had a tender very recently just north of Lisbon for the conversion of a 500 megawatt coal power station to renewables. That came out, as I say, very recently. So some of the big companies such as EDP, Galp, and so on, some of the Spanish utilities are involved in that tender. So that just shows Portugal's commitment to phasing out its fossil fuel power stations. And as I mentioned before, green hydrogen is another renewable energy source that Portugal is now pushing hard, as with the rest of Europe. And there are now generous incentives which are gradually coming out to build and operate green hydrogen facilities, which I'll talk about later. Just looking at figures for renewables in Portugal, annual production figures over the past 10 years or so. And you can see the total at the top of the table there, the top left, that 20,404 gigawatt hours of energy renewables in 2012 has now increased to around 34,000. So a significant increase in renewable energy production. A lot of Portugal's renewable comes from hydroelectric power, particularly in the north of Portugal. And you can see there's been a significant increase from around 6,000 in 2012 to 15,000 as we speak now. So significant increase in hydro there. Aeolica is wind. And again, a fair increase there, about 30%, from 10,000 in 2012 up to 13,000 this year. You've got other areas there, biomass, cogeneration is CHP, biogas, geothermal, and photovoltaic. That's an interesting one at the bottom there. You can see that there was 400 gigawatt hours in 2012. It's now increased to almost 2,000. So a massive increase in solar capacity there in Portugal. Moving on to the next one, which is actually installed capacity. So the previous table was actual production. This is installed capacity in megawatts. And again, you can see a 50% increase there in total renewables at the top of the top line there in the past 10 years or so. So significant increase in hydroelectric, the other renewables. Wind obviously has increased quite significantly. But again, looking at photovoltaic, you can see there that back in 2012 was 244 megawatts of installed capacity in Portugal. That's now increased to almost 1,300, so a massive increase in solar capacity in Portugal. And also, interesting enough, right at the bottom there, FV is concentrated solar, solar photovoltaic, where we have 15 megawatts. A map there of renewables by region in Portugal. So the dark blue is hydroelectric power, the light blue is wind, orange is biomass, and the yellow is photovoltaic. So you can see there in the north, it's predominantly hydro. In the centre of Portugal, predominantly wind. Lisbon is actually a mixture really of renewables. The Alentejo south of Lisbon, again, a strong hydro electric power with a strong photovoltaic, a lot of sunshine. And again, a lot of wind and a lot of wind in the Algarve, at the south there. Obviously, it is a windy region, but also a growing amount of photovoltaic as well. And that will only increase. Moving on now to green hydrogen, which I say is very much the subject to consider at the moment, very relevant this year throughout Portugal and the European Union. And as the slide says there, it has the potential to become one of the main fuels in a low carbon economy. I know in the UK, they have started already building facilities, I believe. So the UK has taken a very dynamic and proactive approach to green hydrogen, which is good to see. And Portugal will follow as well. And it covers a broad range of applications and hopefully will be a game changer as far as low carbon solutions are concerned. And just to give you some ideas of the applications there for transport, power, industry, building, chemicals and products. And the beauty of hydrogen obviously is carbon neutral. It's in terms of production, when it's produced from green energy, it produces just hydrogen and oxygen. So a very clean form of fuel, which is hopefully the future. Carrying on with green hydrogen. Green hydrogen is strategic for Portugal to achieve carbon neutrality, with some figures there and icons you can see there, the goals for 2030. So large incorporation of renewable energy sources in its energy mix, competitive renewable energy prices, an existing modern gas structure and geographic location. The great thing about Portugal is we do have a very good infrastructure for both gas and electricity. It is a location where there's lots of sunshine, lots of wind. So in terms of producing hydrogen from renewables, it works extremely well. And we have a very good network infrastructure to transport, whether it be electricity or gas, around Portugal and into the rest of Europe. Obviously, we have interconnectors for both gas and electricity into Europe. So in terms of green hydrogen, Portugal can be a leader in that area for those reasons. Moving on now to residential options. This is an important market here. And when I say residential, this also covers businesses as well. So when I talk about residential, you should also bear in mind that this can be applied to businesses here in Portugal. So as well as houses, it can be applied to industrial premises, business premises, office blocks, so on and so forth. And then there's three main areas of interest here that I'll talk about. There's obviously photovoltaic solar to produce electricity, thermal solar to produce heat, whether it be for hot water, heating, and so on, and heat pumps. And obviously, heat pumps is very much the flavour of the month in the UK at the moment. As I've seen there in the press, the government now are pushing for businesses and homes to change their gas boilers for heat pumps. And it's the same here in Europe. They are pushing now hard for gas boilers to be phased out. So firstly, talking about the solar options for businesses and residences, there are two types. Grid connected, which is more applicable probably to most premises, where the solar system is installed normally on a roof or can be installed on land. And then the system is connected to the grid, but also provides power for the premises. So it is auto-consumption. And the other system I mentioned here is off-grid. This more applies to residences really than residential applications rather than businesses. And this is sites where if people want to be very green or there's no national grid or electricity supply available, you can have off-grid systems with batteries. Moving on to thermal solar. Thermal solar, there are three main applications here. The first one is sanitary hot water, very popular in Portugal, and I know in the UK as well, that you can use the solar to heat up your domestic hot water, sanitary hot water, obviously backed up by a boiler or a heat pump, even better. Space heating, again, thermal solar works very well with heat pumps in terms of providing space heating, and that can be ideally and works extremely well with underfloor heating. We do have a lot of houses here in Portugal with underfloor type heating systems, which works very well because it's low temperature heating. So a very good application there with thermal solar and pool heating. There are systems out there that dedicated systems for pool heating, which is a very simple type of black plastic type panels that can just be used for pool heating. Or you can actually design and build integrated systems for thermal solar that do all three, that do hot water, space heating and pool heating, complete package that will do all those applications. So again, that can be done quite easily for both residences and businesses. And finally, heat pumps. Heat pumps obviously are becoming more and more important and are widely used now in Portugal, and I know in the UK and many parts of Europe. And there are two types of heat pump, as I'm sure many of you will know. There's a ground source or geothermal type heat pump and air source heat pump. For those of you who don't know, the ground source heat pump actually is a water-to-water heat pump where the water on the primary side circulates through the ground and uses the ground to either extract the heat or extract the cooling, whether you're heating or cooling depending on what mode you're in, but essentially uses the ground as a source of heat. That can work extremely well actually in Northern Europe, where you get very low ambient temperatures, and whereas the ground temperature is more stable. So your ground temperature in the UK, if you go fairly deep, may only be around 10 degrees, whereas obviously your air temperature during winter will drop to 0 and less. But in the case of Portugal, particularly down here in the Algarve, ground source is not a great application because we don't get those sort of low temperatures. And there is more maintenance required. There's more things that can go wrong with the ground source heat pump. So we tend to find here in Portugal, particularly down here in the Algarve in the south, where we have mild temperatures, that the air source type heat pump is a much more appropriate application. And you also get air source heat pumps in the UK as well. And basically there you're using the air to extract the heat instead of the ground. And obviously that works extremely well and can be up to 4 times more efficient than, for example, using electricity to heat, and much more efficient than using gas and other fossil fuels. So a very green and efficient way of heating and cooling are the air source heat pumps. Again, as I mentioned, similar to the thermal solar systems I mentioned, the applications for heat pumps can be underfloor heating, radiator heating to a degree, and pool heating, and even hot water, sanitary hot water heating as well. So the heat pump works very well, particularly down here where we get a lot of sunshine in conjunction with solar systems to provide heating at that level. So that's the end of my presentation. I'd like to thank the British Portuguese Chamber of Commerce and obviously Staffordshire Chamber of Commerce for inviting me to give this presentation. Obviously, I'd be happy to answer any questions by email or communications via the British Portuguese Chamber of Commerce. But thank you very much indeed.
So thank you very much, Colin. It was really interesting actually listening to a business perspective on this. Up until this point, we've looked mainly at the kind of membership organisation, the chamber perspective on all of these markets. But if you're going to be pursuing supply chain opportunities, it's most likely going to be people like Colin who you're going to be engaging with. So really useful stuff, really interesting insights. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, slight change to the agenda that was written in the brochure. I will be taking on Ian's role for this particular presentation, which is basically going to be going over some of the regulatory and the political changes, mostly coming out of COP, but also the kind of business effects and opportunities associated with renewable energy opportunities. So next slide, please. Just to hit the ground running, I want to go over the political kind of framework, because ultimately it's the political framework that influences the regulatory framework, which in turn influences the effects on business. Now obviously COP26, pretty obvious, we're going through that right now. In fact, that comes to an end this week, just when hopefully world leaders, business leaders invariably come to an agreement on the climate change plan moving forward. But it's both COP26 and the UN's 2021 climate change report that's put renewable energy and clean energy sources in the spotlight. We've all seen the scenes in Northern Europe of flooding, Southern Europe of fires, the kind of migration and famine in all over the world. Climate change is kind of having a more astute effect, at least from my own observations. It's become more than just that thing that's mentioned in the news from time to time. It's becoming a serious issue. And like Neil mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, we need new sources of energy, new means of renewable energy, clean energy, because when we talk about emissions, a lot of that comes from our energy consumption, because that consumption needs to be catered for, so it needs to be produced, and the producers of energy need to look at that. So that's most likely going to come out of COP, and also the findings from the 2021 climate change report. A new focus on these kinds of energy sources. Next slide, please. Post-pandemic, so we're just coming out of the COVID-19 pandemic. Touch wood, of course, we don't recede back. But I think one of the benefits, if we can say that, is this new focus that actually we don't need to work from an office 5 days a week. We don't need to commute every day. We can have a different business model in actually doing things. And this concept of building back better, taking some value from the pandemic, which actually reduced emissions, I think is really going to play a part, particularly this concept of circular economy, reusing things and recycling more, so we have a more sustainable society. Next slide, please. The internet, rise of activism. So this is a new one, an interesting one. Everyone has a smartphone. Everyone has access to the internet. It doesn't take much for one disgruntled customer or one individual with a strong opinion to post that and for it to go viral and gain traction. And that puts a lot of pressure on businesses. It puts a lot of pressure on government as well. And ultimately it's that which is also driving the political agenda, particularly that which is coming out of COP, because the internet has made politicians, business leaders a lot closer to the people affected in society. So I think moving forward, organisations, big and small, are probably going to take a much more political approach, a much more PR and reputational approach to when they're developing their sustainability plans. Next slide, please. Global Britain. So, we're coming up to the 1 year anniversary of leaving the European Union, and this term Global Britain tends to be bandied about quite a bit. But what does that mean exactly? Well, personally, I think one of the tenets of that is Britain's going to carve a place for itself on the world stage of climate change, of pushing clean energy, pushing sustainability, and ultimately pushing for climate change to be receded. Amongst other things, I think that's going to take a much pressing position in the political agenda, very much pushed by this current government. It's hard to imagine it not being pushed by future governments, irrespective of the parties they are represented by. Next slide, please. So, obviously the politics doesn't really matter. It's rhetoric most of the time. It only matters when it's translated into regulation and legislation, because they are the practical building blocks for how we actually deal with a problem. And that's ultimately what will place limitations on businesses. Again, I don't want to go through this in too much detail. We don't have the time, and I'm not qualified enough to talk on this matter. But one of the key legislative points around climate change in this country is the Climate Change Act of 2008. I think that the key takeaway of that was this target to reduce our emissions in terms of 1990 standards by about 80% come 2050 is probably the massive takeaway. Actually, recently that was amended somewhat. It's now 100% by 2050. So as you can imagine, there's a bit more pressure kind of going in terms of net zero. Next slide, please. I'll glance over this. Climate change risk assessment. Essentially, that outlined the effects of what climate change has on Britain. So think about flooding risks, think about coastal erosion. Essentially, it's if climate change isn't changed, if the course of that hasn't been amended, the ultimate risks that are arisen from that. Next slide, please. Climate Change Committee. So essentially this is an advisory body that's set up to advise government, whether it's local, national, and also the devolved governments on how to kind of prevent the risks outlined in the risk assessment in 2017. So as you can imagine, when we go down this scale from the Climate Change Act to the risk assessment to the CCC, we get more of an actionable point. The Act doesn't really describe how we can save ourselves from this, nor does the risk assessment, but the Climate Change Committee is an advisory body. It kind of holds government and various government agencies to account on how well they're achieving their goals in reducing emissions. Next slide, please. NAP. So this sets out to the government, businesses and society what they're doing to make themselves climate change ready. Essentially, it's more actionable points, and it puts more emphasis on the businesses and the individuals themselves on how they can change the course or help change the course. Because where climate change is concerned, I think we're moving away from these kind of high level kind of accountabilities, and now it's become the responsibility of everyone, whether it's a business, whether it's an individual, whether it's a government or a government agency, or whether it's a number of nations. Of course, it's all our own planet, so it makes sense that the responsibility trickles downwards. Next slide, please. But this is probably the more important piece of regulatory and legislative implementation. The LAAP sets out more specifically the opportunities and compliance requirements on businesses and local government. So local government, and then ultimately trickles down to the businesses themselves. This sets things like sustainable transport. It provides opportunities for renewable energy and low carbon technologies. So it actively encourages opportunities around this. Of course, we look at global warming and climate change as being very negative, which of course it is. But what this tends to do is flip it the other way. It makes it a bit more of an opportunity basis, whether that's opportunity in investment, opportunity in financing particular projects, or whether it's opportunities in terms of projects and contracts with local government or with government in general. So again, as we go down the ladder, it becomes a bit more actionable. And again, don't want to focus too much on these. You can go to these legislative points, look through them yourself and see where the opportunities present. But ultimately, this provides the regulatory framework from the political framework on how to kind of actionably take account of what businesses need to do, or what everyone needs to do. Next slide, please. So how does this all affect businesses? Because obviously that's probably the more important thing to consider. We've gone through the political framework, we've gone through the regulatory framework, but ultimately, why would you care about this? What are the likely effects? So obviously COP is still going. That ends end of this week. Hopefully they reach some kind of agreement and we get more kind of security in what needs to happen. In other words, businesses don't mind changing as long as they know what they have to change to. So what are those likely effects going to be? I think one of the biggest ones, which I think came out this morning or yesterday, was the onus on businesses to actually publish their plans for sustainability. And this is likely going to increase ESG metrics being used. So for those who don't know, ESG, environmental, social and governance, relates to this concept of the triple bottom line, planet, profits, and people, how your business actually furthers these goals. Making profit isn't enough anymore, especially if that profit actually reduces the benefit to society, or if it's at the cost of society. Like I said, rise in activism, the internet makes activism a lot easier for people. If a company's just focusing on profits and is, polluting an ocean or, tearing up the Amazon rainforest or something, that's obviously going to bring about negative PR, and ultimately that's going to damage the company itself. So it's very likely moving forward that, okay, for now it's going to be large businesses affected by this, but that's ultimately going to trickle down. The KPIs set by ESG metrics all businesses will need to adhere to those metrics, and they'll probably need to explain in their accounts why they haven't hit those KPIs if they haven't. Next slide, please. Another big one, particularly where UK export finance is concerned, withdrawal of support for oil, gas and coal. So the government won't touch these projects anymore. It will not support them. If you're selling exclusively to oil and gas companies and you have a contract and you want to get UKEF financing, or guarantees, should I say, backing your bank, it won't happen because you're not adhering to the government's agenda. You know, it would be a bit hypocritical if the government's trying to affect climate change and all of a sudden it's granting guarantees to projects in oil and gas. So this is going to encourage businesses to change their kind of supply chain, downstream or upstream. You know, it's going to encourage oil and gas suppliers, or those that supply within oil and gas sector, to actually change gears, change their product to service the renewable sector, for instance, or service something that ultimately is a bit more climate change positive. Next slide, please. Again, pressure through financing. This relates to the previous point. So in the same way that UKEF will not support projects in oil and gas, the pressure is likely going to trickle down to the financing houses, the banks, the private equity companies. I think it was the other day, outside of Standard Chartered, protests around them supporting or financing projects in dirty energy. That's not only going to become more regular, I would imagine, but there's going to be actual regulatory pressure on these businesses from the government to withdraw support in these sectors. Next slide, please. Supply chain pressure. So, okay, a lot of you are SMEs, a lot of you are not huge multinational conglomerates, but chances are you supply into bigger companies, or chances are the companies you supply into also supply into bigger companies. And if they have pressure on government to be more sustainable and publish their plans and so forth, that's only ever going to trickle down into the supply chain. So you don't want to find yourself in a situation where your biggest client turns down your business because you're not sustainable enough. That's going to happen because it all trickles down. Like I said, it's everyone's responsibility, right down to the individuals. So, larger companies aren't going to shoot themselves in the foot by buying from a company that isn't sustainable. So that's only ever going to be the likely effect moving forward. Next slide, please. Sanctions. So again, coming out of COP, Russia, China, they don't tend to be particularly cooperative where climate change is concerned. Moving forward, I'd say it's quite likely that there will be sanctions on countries like that if they don't change their ways, if they don't adhere to certain targets. I think most of the countries are represented at COP, even those who are quite big that are not. They're going to have to bow to external pressure. And if you're a business that sells to Russia, China, or buys from Russia, China, that's only ever going to affect you if there's possible sanctions. So that too is a likely effect on businesses moving forward. Next slide, please. Compliance costs. So every business generally calls upon the services of an accountant, a solicitor. If you're big enough, an auditor. Tracking these ESG metrics and providing and publishing sustainability plans, that's likely going to increase costs also, because you're going to have to get an external party to do that for you, most likely. Next slide, please. Capital costs. If your equipment is outdated and not fit for purpose, or you need to update it, that's going to have capital costs attached to it. So that's another likely effect. Next slide, please. And operating costs. Again, if you need to do something more energy efficient or more sustainably, and it's more expensive to do that, then that constitutes an increase in operating costs. So yeah, that's again kind of adding to the kind of overhead section of the income statement. It's going to be additional costs, it's going to be additional pressure on the company. So this is ultimately where the organisations of the chambers and the DIT come in, because these are all negative effects. You know, this is all quite daunting to businesses, and there might be more effects that I haven't touched upon or I've even thought about. And if you have to comply with them, then chances are you'll need some support in doing that. Next slide, please. So now I want to go through the Staffordshire Chambers of Commerce and the Department for International Trade, and ultimately how these two organisations can help you, how they can support you in not only the opportunities that have presented themselves, so supplying into Saudi Arabia, supplying into Portugal, how they can support you in that export journey, but also how you can adhere to the compliance requirements that are likely to incur moving forward. Next slide, please. So we'll start with the Chamber. I work directly for the Chamber. I work very closely with the DIT team, but I'm not DIT, but I can talk about the Chamber. So what is the Chambers of Commerce? Many of you are members, and as you'll know, the Staffordshire Chambers of Commerce is independent. It's private sector membership organisation run for the members. A lot of the board is comprised of members. There's a rotation. In other words, it's there for you. It's not for profit. We support our membership, and we are an accredited British Chambers of Commerce. You know, we are part of the BCC, as is the Saudi British Joint Business Council, as is the British Portuguese Chambers of Commerce. We are all part of that BCC network. Next slide, please. Chamber Customs. So if you're going to be tapping into international markets, your chances are need to complete your customs declarations. Your chances are might need additional paperwork, EUR1s, UK EUR1s, or any other kind of documentation. Chamber Customs facilitates that for you. We can help you go through that. And yeah, that kind of does it in a more centralized, more professional manner than, say, doing it yourself. Next slide, please. So, other chamber organisations, like I mentioned, the Saudi British Joint Business Council and the British Portuguese Chambers of Commerce, that is part of what is called the Global Business Network within the British Chambers of Commerce. They are a bilateral organisation, each of them, that represents British interests in these specific countries. Next slide, please. And as you can see, there's quite a lot of representation. I don't think this is the exhaustive list. I think that altogether is about 50, I'll say more than 50 chambers, because I know it's more than that, but I want to kind of cover myself. In other words, there's representation in quite a lot of important regions around the world. And even if there is no representation in a specific country, so for instance, I notice Mexico isn't on there, Brazil isn't on there, massive marketplaces. I don't think Canada is either, but there are bilateral organisations that can support you with that. They're not part of the BCC, but I myself do have connections with them. So in other words, if there's a region that doesn't happen to be on this list, I can support you in gaining contact with that. But within the BCC network, there's quite a lot of representation, and that gives the British businesses a lot of exposure in these marketplaces. Next slide, please. So wider access, the Chamber helps facilitate such access, whether it's access to government on the local, national, or sometimes international level, whether that's funding, so again, through government and grants, or in terms of other funding sources, we have contacts in that area, or any other kind of access. The Chamber is generally comprised of professionals from all walks of life, whether that's finance, law, international trade, HR, you name it, there's someone within the Chamber network, if not the Staffordshire Chambers itself, that can help facilitate that. And a lot of the time, you don't even need to be a Chamber member. So for instance, the Growth Hub, which kind of sits closely with the Chamber, we don't discriminate against in terms of membership. You might benefit from membership, but ultimately, if you need help with something, for instance, during the pandemic, there was a lot of support required for COVID, then the Chamber / the Growth Hub can kind of support you in that. And also other members, you're part of a membership organisation. Who's to say you can't get in contact with other members within the chambers, whether it's our chamber or another one, and, you know, strike up a conversation and potentially work out a business partnership of some description. That's probably one of the benefits of a membership organisation, the other businesses outside of the support that's generally offered through that organisation. Next slide, please. And business planning, whether it's exporting, market entry, finance, compliance, anything of that description, we, myself included, can help you through that. We can sit down with you, we can look at the problem, look at the objective, and we can kind of guide you in the right direction. We can help plan the export plan for you, the business plan in terms of getting financing. That support is open to you. Next slide, please. And pipeline opportunities. So again, speaking from my own perspective, working very closely with different chambers, both within the BCC and outside of it, as well as other business groups, and DIT staff from around the world, I built up quite a bit of a pipeline. And of course, that pipeline is only really as useful as the people I can send that to. So if you ever need an export opportunity, for instance, or another business opportunity, or to find a partner or an agent, then I can guide you in that direction, because chances are there's something in my own personal pipeline which I'm updating by the day, which I can kind of point in your direction and we can discuss it. I'm not an engineer, I'm not a EPC contractor, I'm not a manufacturer of pipes and valves. You know, that would be where the technical expertise from your perspective can come in, so that I can help you market yourself into the opportunity and ultimately win that business. So that's the chamber in a nutshell. Next slide, please. Now we're going to go over to the DIT side. And as you'll see, there's quite a lot of crossover between the DIT and the chambers. The DIT is what I describe as a multi-purpose ministerial government department. So what does that mean outside of the kind of typical political words I've just thrown there? So it's multi-purpose because it serves both a policy purpose and a business support function. So on the policy side, the DIT goes out and represents Britain, it forms trade deals, it negotiates trade deals, it looks out for the commercial diplomatic interests of the United Kingdom. And on the business support side, it employs international trade advisors that can very much step in the same way that I can here at the Chambers to guide you in terms of winning business, finding export opportunities, finding partners, finding agents, and ultimately being the specific elements that actually drive the international trade growth of the United Kingdom. It's ministerial because it's headed by a minister as opposed to a senior civil servant. So for instance, there's a cabinet minister in charge of the DIT which goes out and negotiates these trade deals on the UK's behalf, and it's governmental for that exact reason. It's a government department, it's funded by taxes, and it represents the interests of the United Kingdom, particularly where international trade is concerned. Next slide, please. In the same way that the Staffordshire Chambers of Commerce has access to the Global Business Network within the BCC, the DIT also has its own network, generally operating outside of the embassies, operating through the embassies. So next slide, please. So just to kind of illustrate that a bit, just shy of 3,000 staff in nearly 200 posts in 109 embassies, consulates and high commissions being kind of the embassies of Commonwealth countries around the world, as well as 9 regions operated by delivery partners, ironically many of whom actually chambers of commerce. So for instance, where Turkey is concerned, the British Chambers of Commerce in Turkey is the delivery partner. So as you can see, there's a lot of kind of connection between the chambers and the DIT. Next slide, please. This is an interesting one. Anything kind of strategic, so military goods, security goods, or those that could be used for military or security purposes, DIT through the UK Defence and Securities Exports team tend to have a monopoly on this. So this might hit more of you than you might think. It's not just about sending purely military items. It could also include technology. So this could be technology, I don't know, maybe you're trying to send to Saudi Arabia in terms of a smart city project. That may very well touch upon a dual use item, and you might need an export license for that. So UK DSE can help you with that. So that's another kind of advantage operating through the Department for International Trade. Next slide, please. UKEF support. So like I mentioned, UKEF Export Finance, that is the UK's export credit agency. And essentially what they do is they support contracts in terms of their working capital requirements in order for exporters to fulfill viable contracts. And it doesn't actually do this by providing funding itself. What it does is it provides guarantees to a bank, for instance, that's providing the loan, and that guarantee acts as a security for the bank to give you the loan. So it doesn't crowd out private sector funding, but it does offer that security that might be the difference between you getting a contract and not. There's quite a lot of products through UKEF, but as I've said, as I've maybe made it sound, it's not quite that simple. There are a few kind of caveats to that. But if you're interested, then get in touch with myself or an international trade advisor, and they can guide you through that specific process, put you in touch with the right person. Next slide, please. And export planning. So in the same way that I and the chambers can support in developing a export plan, a business plan, let's assume you want to break into a marketplace, so we can go through the kind of pestle factors as well as the other legal factors, the general business viability. The DIT can do this as well. The international trade advisors can guide you through the export planning process, and yeah, have a plan of action that you can actually implement. They can also put you in touch with the right people. So for instance, if your export plan is around exporting to a specific country, they can put you in touch with the right contacts, but specifically throughout the embassies there. Where the chamber, just to kind of add a bit of an aside, where the chamber tends to do a bit better, I feel, is because you're dealing with membership organisations. The BPCC, the Saudi British Joint Business Council, they're all membership organisations. They will have people in their own membership who can help you potentially act as a partner on the ground. And because you're operating through a BCC accredited chamber that is, you have that kind of trust element in markets which may or may not be otherwise difficult to enter. So that's just a bit of an aside, but ultimately the DIT can help support in export planning as well. Next slide, please. And there are my contact details, as well as Ian's, who, like I said, was meant to be presenting today but couldn't. His details are there as well. So drop me a question, or drop me, a line if you want to work with me on any of these, or if you want a connection in any market that's been mentioned, or anything in that particular way. Next slide, please. And I'm going to end quite quickly because I feel like I've kind of gone on for way too long. But this is where I kind of want to have a bit of a call to action. An hour and a half is not a great deal of time to go through all of the opportunities present in these markets, those that were explored, as well as markets in other sectors. I actually want this to be a bit of a pilot for a longer, more network orientated event in more regions. So we can go back to Portugal, we can go back to Saudi Arabia, we can bring in Brazil, Taiwan. They're two markets I wanted to bring in, or any other market that you might want to think about. But that needs to be driven by your own interest. I really want to have something network orientated, because to me, good business in the international stage is connecting with a good partner, and that's best done through the chambers. So yeah, drop me a line. Let's have a conversation. Let's see where a specific mission like that could help you. Or, if you want to get in contact with me about the opportunities presented that we've just discussed, that is also something I'm willing to kind of get going. Chris, Colin, everyone else at the kind of chambers, they want to work with British businesses. That's their mantra. That's why they exist, for lack of a better term, to serve the interests of British businesses. That's why they're part of the BCC. So without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, I will leave it there, and I do hope to talk to you very soon. Drop me an email. You'll have my contact details through the brochure. So again, scan that QR code on the leaflet on your chair, and let's talk. And again, if you want to get in touch with Chris or Colin or anyone else that was mentioned, get in touch with me, or wait for the recording. Once this is all edited, made a bit more kind of internet friendly, as I've kept saying, then I will certainly send that to you, and that asset will exist for future reference forever. So without that, thank you very much for listening to me and everyone else that's come. Big thanks to the speakers, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you very much.